They didn't tell me I had been moved. I found out when I reached for my place card and someone else's name was sitting where mine used to be. The rehearsal dinner was held in a private dining room overlooking the harbor. Soft golden light reflected off the water through tall windows. Long white linens draped the tables. Candles flickered just enough to feel intimate without dimming the room. It was elegant, intentional, carefully arranged. I had seen the seating chart 2 weeks earlier. My name had been placed at the long center table between my son and the bride's father, balanced, appropriate, family. That word matters the night before a wedding. Family is who shaped the groom. The family is who built the foundation. Family is who sits at the table closest to the couple when gratitude is spoken aloud. But when I arrived that evening, bouquet in hand, my name was no longer there. I stood at the edge of the long table and scanned each small cream card carefully. My son's name, the bride's, her parents, her aunt, her cousin, even a childhood friend seated near the center. My name was not among them. There is a particular silence that happens inside you when something small becomes clear. Not dramatic, not loud, just precise. A server approached gently from my right. "Are you Elaine Mercer?" he asked with professional warmth. "Yes." He smiled and gestured toward a smaller round table near the far window. "We've prepared a seat for you over there." Prepared. Such a thoughtful-sounding word. I followed his gesture. The smaller table sat slightly apart from the long one, close enough to remain visible, far enough to remain separate. It was arranged for extended relatives and out-of-town guests, lovely, but not central. I looked back once more at the long table. There, directly between my son and the bride's father, sat a new card, her aunt. The adjustment had been deliberate, not accidental, not last-minute confusion, replaced. I did not sigh. I did not ask questions. The bride's mother stood at the far end of the table speaking to the event coordinator. She adjusted a candle, straightened a fork, moved a place card half an inch. Her movements were controlled, confidence. Her eyes flicked toward me briefly, then away. No surprise there. She already knew. Guests were beginning to take their seats. Soft laughter filled the room. Glasses clinked. Someone commented on the view. My son had not yet arrived at the table. He was near the entrance, greeting relatives, still unaware. I walked slowly toward the smaller table. Each step felt measured, not heavy. I placed my bouquet gently on the center of the round table and smoothed my blazer before sitting. From this position, I had a full view of the room. The long rectangular table in the center dominated the center. It was where the speeches would happen, where the photographs would focus, where tomorrow's narrative would quietly begin forming. The rehearsal dinner is not just a meal. It is a rehearsal for positioning. It tells everyone who stands closest to the couple, who speaks, who is photographed, who is remembered as central. And tonight, I had been moved to the perimeter. A cousin seated beside me leaned in softly. "I thought you'd be up there," she whispered. "So did I replied calmly. Across the room, my son finally approached the long table. He stopped for half a second. He scanned the place cards. His eyes moved left, then right, then left again. He noticed. It was subtle, a tightening of the jaw, a pause in posture. He looked across the room instinctively. Our eyes met. I did not wave. I did not signal. I did not rescue him from the realization. I simply held his gaze for one steady second. That was enough. He looked back at the table, then at the bride who had just joined him, sliding her hand gently into his. Dinner was about to begin. The candles glowed, the water outside shimmered. The family table was full, except it wasn't, because moving a chair is simple, but moving significance leaves a space you can feel from across the room. And before the first toast was made, something inside that carefully arranged dinner had already begun to shift. The rehearsal dinner had the kind of atmosphere that makes people lower their voices without being asked. Soft golden pendant lights hung over the long central table, casting a warm glow across polished silverware and neatly folded linen napkins. Crystal glasses reflected the candlelight in gentle flickers. At the far end of the room, tall windows framed the harbor, the water darkening as evening settled in. Everything felt curated, intentional, balanced. The long rectangular table in the center formed a wide U shape. It was unmistakably the focal point. At its center were two small gold nameplates, the bride and the groom. From there, the seating radiated outward in careful symmetry. Bride's mother, the bride's father, her aunt, her cousin, close family friends. On the other side, my son's father, a distant uncle, a college roommate, and in the place where my name had once been printed, her aunt now sat, smoothing her napkin with quiet satisfaction. The smaller round tables near the perimeter were arranged for additional guests. They were lovely, set with the same linens and candles, but their positioning told a different story. They were not within the camera's natural line of sight. They were not within arm's reach of the microphone that had been placed near the head of the long table. From my seat near the window, I could see everything clearly. Visibility without centrality. That is a deliberate arrangement. A server poured water into my glass. I thanked him. Across the room, laughter rose from the long table as someone commented on an engagement photo displayed on a small easel nearby. The photographer began taking early candid shots. He circled the long table first, angles from above, close-ups of hands intertwined, soft focus shots of the bride leaning toward her mother. The smaller tables remained outside his frame. This was rehearsal, after all, rehearsal for tomorrow's hierarchy. The bride's mother stood briefly and adjusted the small printed menus at each seat along the long table. She straightened a place card, shifted a wine glass half an inch, ensured the symmetry remained intact. Her movements were not rushed. They practiced. Across from her, my son had finally taken his seat. He did not sit back immediately. He looked down at the name cards once more. Then he glanced toward me, not long enough to draw attention, just enough to confirm what he had already seen. I held my posture steady, hands folded lightly in my lap, expression neutral. He leaned slightly toward the bride and said something quietly. She responded with a small nod and a reassuring smile, the kind designed to smooth over minor disruptions before they become noticeable. Minor. That is how these things are categorized. A minor adjustment, a minor shift, a minor inconvenience. But positioning is never minor at a table like this. The bride's father tapped his glass gently. The room softened. Tomorrow, he began warmly, is the official celebration. Tonight is about the people who shaped this journey. Shaped. Another careful word. He gestured along the length of the long table as he spoke. Those who have been central from the beginning. Central. He did not look toward the perimeter. He did not need to. Language frames the room just as effectively as seating charts. Applause followed politely, glasses lifted. My son smiled, but it did not fully reach his eyes. He was listening differently now. He looked down at the table arrangement once more, then across the room toward me again. This time his goal. The bride reached for his hand under the table. He allowed it, but his posture remained slightly forward, engaged, observing. The first course was served. Plates were placed first at the long table, then several minutes later at the smaller ones. Subtle, but noticeable. A cousin seated beside me leaned in softly. "I thought you'd be up there," she said. "So did I replied gently. Across the room, the photographer repositioned again. He asked the long table to lean in slightly for a group shot. Chairs shifted closer together, shoulders touched, arms draped naturally across the backs of seats. The image being captured would suggest unity, alignment, foundation. But even from the perimeter, imbalance can be felt. My son's smile appeared in the photograph, but his eyes were elsewhere. The rehearsal dinner had officially begun. The hierarchy had been demonstrated without being announced, and the correction, though not yet spoken, was already forming in his posture. Because sometimes the clearest shift in a room does not happen when someone is moved. It happens when someone else finally notices they have been. The first course was cleared with quiet efficiency. Plates lifted, glasses refreshed, candles adjusted. The rhythm of the evening had settled into something smooth and controlled. At the long table, conversation flowed easily. Stories about childhood mischief, college memories, light teasing about tomorrow's ceremony. Laughter rose in warm waves, the kind that photographs well. At the perimeter tables, the tone was softer. Polite exchanges, careful smiles, observations about the view. The bride's mother stood again, lifting her glass. "I'd like to say something about tomorrow," she began. The room turned naturally toward the long table. Even from where I sat, I felt the gravitational pull of that center. "Tomorrow," she said warmly, "we celebrate two families becoming one. But tonight is for the people who have guided them closely, day by day." Closely. Her gaze moved deliberately along the long table as she spoke. "My sister, who has helped coordinate every detail." Her sister smiled. "My husband, who has supported every decision." He nodded graciously. "And of course," she continued, placing her hand briefly over her daughter's, "the parents who have stood right beside them." Parents, plural. My son's father lifted his glass from his seat at the long table. Applause followed. It was not excessive, just enough. No one looked toward the window. No one looked toward the smaller tables. The reduction was not spoken directly. It was implied through omission, and omission, when repeated gently, can be more effective than confrontation. I did not lower my gaze. I did not shift in my chair. I remained still, listening. Across the room, my son did something subtle. He did not immediately raise his glass. He hesitated, half a second. Then he lifted it, but his eyes were not on the speaker. They were scanning, searching. They found me again. This time there was no question in his expression, only awareness. The bride reached for his hand under the table. He allowed it, but his posture remained slightly forward, engaged, observing. The first course was served. Plates were placed first at the long table, then several minutes later at the smaller ones. Subtle, but noticeable. A cousin seated beside me leaned in softly. "I'm surprised," she said. "At what?" I asked gently. "You're his mother." "Yes." She glanced toward the long table, then back at me. I assumed. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Assumptions often reveal hierarchy before anyone names it. Across the room, my son pushed his plate slightly aside and leaned back in his chair. He was no longer fully participating in the easy laughter around him. He was observing. The bride's father began telling a story about how he had watched this relationship grow from the very beginning. From the very beginning. Interesting phrase. Beginnings are rarely singular. My son's shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. He turned his head slowly toward the perimeter, toward me, toward the table that had been designated for extended presence. Our eyes met again. I did not offer rescue, no expression of injury, no silent plea, only steadiness. That steadiness unsettled him more than protest would have, because protest could be dismissed as emotion. Stillness cannot. The reduction had now been layered. First the seating, then the toast, then the framing, then the language, each one small enough to defend individually, together unmistakable, and he could feel it. The bride noticed his attention shifting. She followed his gaze toward the window table. Her expression flickered for the briefest moment, calculation, then composure returned. She leaned toward her mother and whispered something. Her mother glanced across the room at me. Our eyes met. She held my gaze for 1 second longer than courtesy required. No apology, not a challenge. Assessment. The subtle reduction had been completed its arc. It had been demonstrated publicly without ever being named. But the most important shift was not happening at the long table. It was happening to my son. Because once someone you love sees imbalance clearly, it becomes difficult to unsee it. He reached for his water glass but did not drink. Instead, he set it down again, and in that small, controlled movement, I recognized something familiar. He was measuring the room, just as I had. The rehearsal dinner was meant to rehearse harmony, but harmony built on quiet displacement rarely sustains itself. And before dessert had even been served, the air between the center table and the perimeter had grown noticeably thin. The subtle reduction had been executed carefully. Now it was being observed carefully, and observation is where correction begins. Dessert had just been placed on the long table when my son stood up. Not abruptly, not dramatically, he simply rose from his chair as if remembering something unfinished. The room quieted instinctively. The sound of silverware against porcelain softened. A few conversations paused mid-sentence. He did not take the microphone. He did not tap a glass. He remained standing beside his chair, hands resting lightly on the back of it. "I want to say something," he began. His tone was steady, calm, controlled. The bride looked up at him with a polite smile, though her posture stiffened slightly. Her mother shifted in her seat, adjusting her napkin. "This dinner," he continued, "is about family." He let the words settle. "And about acknowledging the people who shaped us long before tomorrow's ceremony." There was no accusation in his voice, no sharpness, only clarity. He turned slightly, not toward the head of the table, but toward the window, toward me. "I wouldn't be sitting here tonight," he said evenly, "without my mother." The room did not erupt, it recalibrated. Heads turned toward the perimeter table for the first time that evening. Even the photographer instinctively pivoted his lens in my direction. I did not stand, I did not wave, I simply met my son's gaze. He continued, "She has been present at every major turning point in my life, and that includes this one." The bride's father shifted uncomfortably, then masked it with a nod. Her mother held her smile in place, though it no longer reached her eyes. My son looked back at the long table. I noticed earlier that seating changed from the original plan. There it was, not explosive, not confrontational, just factual. A few guests exchanged brief glances. The bride leaned toward him and murmured something, her tone low and careful. He listened, then nodded once. "Yes," he said gently, "it matters." That sentence was not loud, but it was unmistakable. It matters. The reduction had been named without being dramatized. He stepped away from his chair. The movement was slow enough to feel deliberate, but natural enough to avoid spectacle. He walked across the room toward the window table. The photographer followed him without instruction. Every step felt like a subtle shifting of weight inside the room. When he reached my chair, he did not extend his hand immediately. He looked down at me first. "Mom," he said quietly, "will you join us?" Not a demand, not a rescue, an invitation. I studied him for a moment. In that brief silence, everyone waited, not anxiously, attentively. "Are you certain?" I asked calmly. "Yes," no hesitation. Behind him, the bride rose slowly from her seat. Her expression was composed, though thoughtful now rather than assured. Her mother remained seated, hands folded carefully in her lap. I stood, not quickly, not reluctantly, simply with poise. As we walked back toward the long table together, a chair was moved, not forcibly, not with embarrassment, just shifted slightly to make space. 6 inches of adjustment, that is all it took. But the meaning of that 6 inches changed the entire dynamic. The photographer captured the moment without prompting. Not the earlier symmetry, not the carefully curated lineup. This one. My son did not make a speech about fairness. He did not reference oversight again. He simply resumed his seat once I was settled beside him. The bride adjusted her chair to accommodate the new spacing. Her movements were precise, controlled. No scene had been created, no voices had been raised, yet the room felt different, balanced. Conversations resumed, but now the center of gravity had shifted slightly, not toward me, toward alignment. The bride's father cleared his throat gently and attempted to restart the tone of the evening. "To family," he said, lifting his glass again. This time, when the word family was spoken, it traveled further down the table, further than before, and when glasses lifted in response, they included mine. Public shift does not require spectacle. It requires recognition spoken aloud. And once recognition enters a room, it rearranges the architecture quietly. The rehearsal dinner continued, but the hierarchy that had been demonstrated earlier no longer held the same authority, because now everyone has witnessed the adjustment, and what is witnessed cannot be undone. He realized, not too late for correction, but late enough to understand the weight of oversight. And from that moment forward, the family table meant something slightly different than it had an hour before. Once I was seated at the long table, the physical adjustment seemed small. One chair shifted, one place setting was added, one linen napkin unfolded, but the emotional shift was unmistakable. The space between my son and the bride's father narrowed, the symmetry of the table altered by inches, the carefully arranged visual balance was no longer perfectly aligned, and that was the point. No one objected aloud, no one created discomfort, yet everyone felt it. The bride's mother lifted her glass again, this time with a slightly tighter smile. To flexibility, she said lightly, attempting warmth. A few guests laughed softly. My son did not. He rested his hands on the table, fingers interlaced, and looked directly ahead. The photographer leaned in for another image. This time he positioned himself slightly to the side, capturing the full length of the table, not just the original arrangement, the revised one. The bride leaned toward me politely. "I hope you're comfortable," she said. "I am," I replied gently. There was no hostility in my tone. None was needed. Across from us, her aunt, the one who had replaced my original seat, now found herself slightly repositioned toward the edge. She adjusted her chair quietly. Not embarrassed, but be aware. Awareness spreads faster than discomfort. The bride's father attempted to restart conversation with a story about tomorrow's schedule. His voice was steady, but his cadence had changed, measured, careful. My son listened politely, but his attention remained divided. He reached for his water glass, then set it down again without drinking. It was a small gesture, but I recognized it. It meant he was thinking. Rehearsal dinners are meant to ease tension before the ceremony. Tonight, the tension had not erupted. It has been clarified. A cousin further down the table leaned toward me and whispered quietly, "I'm glad you're here." I nodded. "So am I." The bride's mother rose once more to offer what was intended to be the final toast of the evening. "This union," she said smoothly, "brings together two strong foundations." She paused. Her eyes moved along the table more carefully this time. "And we're grateful to everyone who helped build them." Everyone. That word had expanded, intentionally. My son lifted his glass without hesitation now. He turned slightly toward me as he did. The gesture was subtle, but visible. When glasses clinked this time, the sound felt different, less curated, more grounded. The visible reaction was not dramatic. It did not fracture the evening. It recalibrated it. My son did not need to defend me loudly. He did not need to confront anyone harshly. His reaction was visible because it was measured, because he refused to pretend the earlier arrangement had been insignificant, because he acted without spectacle, and that made it impossible to dismiss. As dessert plates were cleared and guests began drifting toward the terrace for coffee, the bride's mother approached me directly. Her expression was composed. "We never meant for you to feel excluded," she said softly. "I didn't," I replied calmly. It was true. Exclusion requires internal agreement. I had not agreed. She studied my face carefully. "Tomorrow will be smoother," she added. "I'm sure it will." My son joined us a moment later. His posture was steady, protective but not defensive. "We'll make sure of that," he said gently. There it was again, not confrontation, correction. The photographer passed by and asked for one final group shot before the evening ended. This time, no one questioned the arrangement, no one adjusted my position, no one suggested alternatives. The long table had absorbed the change. The image captured would show balance, not because it had been planned that way from the beginning, but because someone noticed before it became permanent. As we stepped out onto the terrace together, overlooking the dark water reflecting city lights, my son exhaled slowly. "I should have seen it sooner," he said quietly. "Yes," I replied. There was no accusation in my voice, just agreement. He nodded once. The visible reaction had already done its work. Tomorrow's ceremony will carry the imprint of tonight's correction. And sometimes realizing late is not failure, it is the foundation. Because once someone sees clearly, they rarely allow the same imbalance twice. And as the evening closed with soft laughter and fading candlelight, I understood something simple. The family table is not secured by name cards. It is secured by who stands when you are moved. Tonight, he stood. The terrace had emptied slowly. Guests drifted back inside to collect coats and say their goodbyes. The harbor lights shimmered quietly beyond the railing, steady and indifferent to the adjustments that had taken place inside. My son remained beside me. He had been gracious with everyone who approached, smiling, thanking them for coming, accepting well wishes for tomorrow. But the moment the last cousin disappeared through the restaurant doors, his composure shifted, not into anger, into reflection. "Mom," he said quietly, turning toward me fully, "did you know before you arrived?" "Yes." He looked surprised.
You saw the chart? I saw the revised one this afternoon. And you didn't call me? No. He studied my face carefully, searching for something. Hurt? Resentment? Disappointment? He found none. I wanted to see if you would notice, I said gently. The honesty landed between us without tension. He exhaled slowly and leaned his forearms against the railing, looking out over the water. I hate that you were moved, he said. I was moved, I corrected softly. I was not diminished. He nodded faintly. Still thinking. Her mom said it was about logistics, that the table needed balance. Balance is interesting. It depends on what you're trying to display. He turned that over in his mind. Inside, I could see the bride speaking quietly with her mother. Their heads leaned close together, their movements controlled. They were not arguing, they were recalculating. Rehearsal dinners reveal more than seating arrangements. They reveal power structures. My son turned back toward me. I approved the original seating. I didn't approve the change. But you allowed someone else to manage it. Yes. The admission was calm. That mattered. Private confrontation is not about forcing guilt. It is about clarifying responsibility. He looked back toward the dining room doors. I should have checked again, he said. Yes. The word was not harsh, just true. He absorbed it without defensiveness. I didn't want to start tension the night before the wedding, he added. I know. And I didn't want you to feel... He paused. Secondary? I offered gently. His jaw tightened slightly. Yes. I rested my hands lightly on the railing. Tomorrow, I said quietly, you will stand at the altar. You will make promises about partnership and alignment. He listened carefully. Alignment begins long before vows. It begins with small decisions. In who gets centered, who gets moved. He turned that over in his mind. Inside, I could see the bride speaking quietly with her mother. Their heads leaned close together, their movements controlled. They were not arguing, they were recalculating. Rehearsal dinners reveal more than seating arrangements. They reveal power structures. My son turned back toward me. I approved the original seating. I didn't approve the change. But you allowed someone else to manage it. Yes. The admission was calm. That mattered. Private confrontation is not about forcing guilt. It is about clarifying responsibility. He looked back toward the dining room doors. I should have checked again, he said. Yes. The word was not harsh, just true. He absorbed it without defensiveness. I didn't want to start tension the night before the wedding, he added. I know. And I didn't want you to feel... He paused. Secondary? I offered gently. His jaw tightened slightly. Yes. I rested my hands lightly on the railing. Tomorrow, I said quietly, you will stand at the altar. You will make promises about partnership and alignment. He listened carefully. Alignment begins long before vows. It begins with small decisions. In who gets entered, who gets moved. He turned that over in his mind. Inside, I could see the bride speaking quietly with her mother, their heads leaned close together, their movements controlled. They were not arguing, they were recalculating. Rehearsal dinners reveal more than seating arrangements. They reveal power structures. My son turned back toward me. I approved the original seating. I didn't approve the change. But you allowed someone else to manage it. Yes. The admission was calm. That mattered. Private confrontation is not about forcing guilt. It is about clarifying responsibility. He looked back toward the dining room doors. I should have checked again, he said. Yes. The word was not harsh, just true. He absorbed it without defensiveness. I didn't want to start tension the night before the wedding, he added. I know. And I didn't want you to feel, he paused. Secondary? I offered gently. His jaw tightened slightly. Yes. I rested my hands lightly on the railing. Tomorrow, I said quietly, you will stand at the altar. You will make promises about partnership and alignment. He listened carefully. Alignment begins long before vows. It begins with small decisions. In who gets centered, who gets moved. He turned that over in his mind. Inside, I could see the bride speaking quietly with her mother, their heads leaned close together, their movements controlled. They were not arguing, they were recalculating. Rehearsal dinners reveal more than seating arrangements. They reveal power structures. My son turned back toward me. I approved the original seating. I didn't approve the change. But you allowed someone else to manage it. Yes. The admission was calm. That mattered. Private confrontation is not about forcing guilt. It is about clarifying responsibility. He looked back toward the dining room doors. I should have checked again, he said. Yes. The word was not harsh, just true. He absorbed it without defensiveness. I didn't want to start tension the night before the wedding, he added. I know. And I didn't want you to feel, he paused. Secondary? I offered gently. His jaw tightened slightly. Yes. I rested my hands lightly on the railing. Tomorrow, I said quietly, you will stand at the altar. You will make promises about partnership and alignment. He listened carefully. Alignment begins long before vows. It begins with small decisions. In who gets centered, who gets moved. He turned that over in his mind. Inside, I could see the bride speaking quietly with her mother, their heads leaned close together, their movements controlled. They were not arguing, they were recalculating. Rehearsal dinners reveal more than seating arrangements. They reveal power structures. My son turned back toward me. I approved the original seating. I didn't approve the change. But you allowed someone else to manage it. Yes. The admission was calm. That mattered. Private confrontation is not about forcing guilt. It is about clarifying responsibility. He looked back toward the dining room doors. I should have checked again, he said. Yes. The word was not harsh, just true. He absorbed it without defensiveness. I didn't want to start tension the night before the wedding, he added. I know. And I didn't want you to feel, he paused. Secondary? I offered gently. His jaw tightened slightly. Yes. I rested my hands lightly on the railing. Tomorrow, I said quietly, you will stand at the altar. You will make promises about partnership and alignment. He listened carefully. Alignment begins long before vows. It begins with small decisions. In who gets centered, who gets moved. He turned that over in his mind. Inside, I could see the bride speaking quietly with her mother, their heads leaned close together, their movements controlled. They were not arguing, they were recalculating. Rehearsal dinners reveal more than seating arrangements. They reveal power structures. My son turned back toward me. I approved the original seating. I didn't approve the change. But you allowed someone else to manage it. Yes. The admission was calm. That mattered. Private confrontation is not about forcing guilt. It is about clarifying responsibility. He looked back toward the dining room doors. I should have checked again, he said. Yes. The word was not harsh, just true. He absorbed it without defensiveness. I didn't want to start tension the night before the wedding, he added. I know. And I didn't want you to feel. He paused. Secondary? I offered gently. His jaw tightened slightly. Yes. I rested my hands lightly on the railing. Tomorrow, I said quietly, you will stand at the altar. You will make promises about partnership and alignment. He listened carefully. Alignment begins long before vows. It begins with small decisions in who gets centered, who gets moved. He nodded slowly. The breeze shifted slightly, lifting the edge of his jacket. I won't let that happen again, he said. I don't need protection, I replied calmly. I need awareness. There is a difference. Protection can become performative. Awareness becomes structural. He straightened, turning fully toward me now. Tomorrow, he said carefully, you'll sit in the front row. I assumed. He allowed himself a faint smile. Center. That's not necessary. It is to me. The firmness in his voice was not reactive. It was grounded. Inside, the bride stepped out onto the terrace. She paused a few steps away, giving us space. Her expression was composed. I know you're upset, she said softly to him. I'm not upset. I'm adjusting. That distinction mattered. She looked at me. I didn't think it would carry that much weight, she said. It doesn't, unless repeated. Her posture shifted slightly at that. Repetition is what defines structure. I didn't want tomorrow to feel unbalanced, she added. It won't, my son said, because we'll correct it. There was no hostility in his tone, only clarity. She nodded slowly. Private reckoning does not require raised voices. It requires willingness to see what was invisible before. I'll speak with my mom, she said quietly. That's between you and her, he replied. I've handled my side. Handled, not fought, not escalated. Handled. We stood there a moment longer in the cool evening air. No one argued, no one defended, no one dramatized it, because the confrontation had already done its work, not to shame, to recalibrate. As we stepped back inside to retrieve coats and say our final goodbyes, I noticed something subtle. The long table, now partially cleared, still held the slight shift where my chair had been inserted. It had disrupted the perfect symmetry, and somehow it looked more honest that way. My son placed his hand lightly at the small of my back as we walked toward the exit. a gesture of grounding. Please do not display. Tomorrow will be the ceremony, but tonight had already revealed what needed to be seen. He realized, not too late for correction, but late enough to understand the cost of inattention, and that understanding would carry further than any toast ever could. The wedding morning arrived without visible tension. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the ceremony hall, warm and steady. White florals lined the aisle. Soft instrumental music drifted across rows of carefully arranged chairs. Everything appeared seamless. If someone had only attended the ceremony, they would never have known a chair had been moved the night before. But recalibration does not erase memory, it refines behavior. When I arrived, an usher greeted me immediately. "Miss Mercer," he said with quiet certainty, "right this way." No visitor badge, no ambiguity. He guided me down the aisle before most guests had even taken their seats. Front row, center section. A printed card rested neatly on the chair. Elaine Mercer. Not guest, not extended family. My name, visible, intentional. I sat down calmly, smoothing my blazer, taking in the space. To my left, my son's father took his seat. To my right, an empty chair remained reserved for a late arriving relative. The positioning was unmistakable, balanced, deliberate. Across the aisle, the bride's parents sat in the mirrored front row. Her mother glanced toward me briefly. Our eyes met. There was no tension in her expression, only awareness. The adjustment had been made, not loudly, not ceremonially, structurally. As guests filled the rows behind us, whispers of admiration passed through the space. "It's beautiful. They did such a good job." Yes, they had. But beauty is easy.
Alignment takes more effort. The music shifted, signaling the beginning of the procession. My son entered first, standing at the altar with calm composure. When his eyes scanned the room, they found me immediately. This time there was no searching, no recalculation, just confirmation. He held my gaze for a second longer than necessary, a silent acknowledgement. The ceremony unfolded with grace. Vows were exchanged, rings placed, applause offered. And at one point, during the officiant's remarks about family foundations, my son's hand tightened slightly around the bride, not nervously, with intention. As the officiant spoke about those who raised and shaped this union, my son turned his head slightly toward the front row, toward both sides, inclusive, not selective. Power recalibration is not about dominance, it is about restoring proportion. After the ceremony, during the formal photographs, the photographer began arranging family groupings. "Parents of the groom first," he called out. I stepped forward without hesitation. There was no confusion this time, no shifting glances, no whispered logistics. The photographer positioned me beside my son, centered in the frame. "Perfect," he said, adjusting the angle slightly. The bride joined the grouping, then her parents. The symmetry of the image felt natural now, not curated to exclude, but arranged to include. Later, at the reception, the head table reflected the same recalibrated structure. My seat was not improvised, it was prepared. My place card rested clearly between my son and the bride's father. No substitutions, no adjustments. When the first toast of the evening began, my son stood and raised his glass. "Yesterday," he said calmly, "we gathered to rehearse today." A few knowing smiles flickered around the room. "And today," he continued, "we celebrate everyone who shaped this moment. Everyone." The word carried weight. He looked toward me briefly, then toward the bride's parents, balanced, intentional. The applause that followed felt genuine, not polite, genuine.
The recalibration had not fractured relationships, it had clarified them. No one needed to mention the rehearsal dinner again. No one needed to defend it. The adjustment had already been spoken. And when a structure corrects itself visibly, it builds credibility. As the evening unfolded with dancing and laughter, I watched my son move through the room with ease. He greeted guests, he thanked relatives, he remained attentive, but there was a steadiness in him now that had not been there before. Awareness has that effect. It deepens posture. Near the end of the night, as the band played the final song, he approached me once more. "You're comfortable?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I replied. He nodded. "I won't miss it again," he said. "I know." Power recalibration is not loud. It does not humiliate. It does not demand an apology. It corrects alignment and moves forward. The family table had been restored, not because someone insisted, because someone realized. And realization, once earned, becomes foundation. Tomorrow, the photographs will show harmony, but beneath the harmony was something more durable, awareness. And awareness holds its shape long after the candles burn out. Weddings end, photographs are edited, flowers are discarded, rental chairs are returned, but what remains is structure. In the weeks after the ceremony, I paid close attention to small things, not to search for fault, to observe whether recalibration had settled or whether it had only been situational. The first indication came quietly. A framed photograph from the wedding arrived by mail. My son had selected the images personally, he told me. Inside the envelope was the portrait taken during the ceremony, front row, centered, balanced. No cropping, no edge placement, no peripheral framing. That was not accidental. Photographs tell the version of history that survives. He had chosen carefully. Later that month, we gathered for a casual Sunday lunch at their home, nothing formal, just a small meal to decompress after the wedding. When I arrived, the table had already been set. Not grand, not ceremonial, but intentional. 4 chairs positioned evenly, no head of the table, no implied hierarchy. The bride greeted me warmly and gestured toward a chair beside her. "Sit here," she said naturally, not directive, not strategic, natural. During the meal, my son asked me for my thoughts about an upcoming work decision. He did not lower his voice. He did not frame it privately. He asked openly, in front of her. The shift was subtle, but consistent. Respect had moved from correction to habit. A few weeks later, I received an email from the bride's mother regarding holiday plans. The tone was measured, thoughtful. "We'd love to coordinate seating earlier this year so everyone feels included." Included. The word had changed. It no longer sounded decorative, it sounded deliberate. I responded simply, "Thank you for thinking ahead." There was no need to revisit the rehearsal dinner. The lesson had already been integrated. Months passed. At a family birthday gathering, I noticed something else. When the long table was arranged in the restaurant, my son waited before sitting. He looked for my place card first, then took his seat. It was instinct now. Awareness repeatedly becomes structure. The bride had shifted as well, not dramatically, but in posture, in language, in acknowledgement. During a toast at that birthday dinner, she said something that settled the recalibration permanently. "I've learned that building a marriage also means honoring the foundations we come from." Her eyes met mine briefly when she said it. No tension, no apology, just recognition. And recognition, when sustained, transforms dynamic. Long-term change rarely arrives with a speech. It arrives in repetition. Invitations addressed properly, chairs positioned without adjustment, names spoken without hesitation. I kept the rehearsal dinner in perspective. It was not betrayal, it was oversight mixed with positioning. and positioning, once corrected, did not return. What mattered most was not that I had been moved, it was that he noticed. And once someone notices clearly, they tend to protect the balance without being asked. The family table no longer felt fragile, it felt anchored. Not because it had never been tested, because it had been, and recalibrated. Respect that survives correction becomes durable, and durability is what holds families together long after ceremonies fade. The rehearsal dinner had revealed something important, not about seating, about awareness. And awareness, once integrated, does not require constant vigilance. It becomes instinct, which meant I no longer needed to measure rooms the way I had that evening. The structure had settled, quietly, firmly, lasting. There is something revealing about a rehearsal dinner. It is not the wedding, it is not the ceremony, it is not the moment captured in framed photographs. It is the preview, the subtle unveiling of how a new family structure intends to position itself. That night, when I reached for my place card and found someone else's name where mine had once been, I understood something immediately. It was not about a chair, it was about narrative. Narratives are built on small decisions. Who is centered? Who is peripheral? Who is acknowledged without being named? I did not argue with the seating chart. I did not interrupt the toast. I did not draw my attention to myself, because true position does not come from protest. It comes from recognition. And recognition cannot be forced. It must be realized. He realized, not in anger, not in spectacle, but in awareness. Awareness is more powerful than defense. When he stood and asked me to join the family table, he did more than move a chair. He corrected the proportion. He established a standard. He signaled that his life would not be built on convenient omission. That is what mattered. There will always be rooms, rooms with long tables, rooms with microphones, rooms with carefully printed name cards, and sometimes in those rooms you may find yourself repositioned, shifted slightly, moved to the edge, asked to accept the perimeter quietly. If you react loudly, you risk being labeled emotional. If you shrink silently, you risk becoming invisible. But if you remain steady, if you allow the imbalance to reveal itself, if you trust what you have built in the people who love you, the correction often comes without you demanding it. That night, the family table did not define me. His response did. The following day, at the ceremony, my seat was clear, centered, printed, undeniable. But even if it had not been, the structure had already changed. Because once someone understands that alignment matters, they do not return to misalignment easily. The rehearsal dinner taught him vigilance, it taught her awareness, and it reminded me of something I have always known. Your value in a family is not determined by where they seat you. It is determined by who stands when you are moved. He stood, not too late for correction, but late enough to understand why it mattered, and that understanding will carry forward long after the candles are extinguished and the photographs are framed. The family table is not wood and linen. It is recognition. It is posture. It is proportionate. And when proportion is restored calmly, it does not create fracture, it creates a foundation. That night, they moved me away from the family table. He realized, and because he did, the next table we sit at will not require adjustment, not because mistakes will never happen, but because awareness now lives in the structure, and that is enough.